The Pentagon has rolled out a new press policy, but is it punishing major American outlets and rewarding Russian voices? Just why is the Pentagon given preferential treatment to America's enemies? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this seems like something kind of innocuous at first blush. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said there's a new pledge required of reporters at the Pentagon, right? And this was actually something that was also covered more extensively by other YouTuber Preston Stewart, who actually was working press at the Pentagon under the Biden administration, or rather with the Biden administration. He actually went on tour with like the Secretary of Defense for a time. But Pentagon now says changing its rules for journalists who cover the Department of Defense. Essentially, going forward, journalists must sign a pledge that they will never gather any information, classified or unclassified, that hasn't been authorized for release from the official Department of Defense, or what their unofficial nickname, Department of War, which is stupid. The 17-page document describes that media who fail to obey the new policy will lose their press credentials, cutting off access to the headquarters of the largest department of the U.S. government. Now, what does this mean? It means that, God, stop calling themselves the Department of War. It's not your name. Information must be approved for public release by an appropriate authorizing official before it is released, even if unclassified. Right? Now, or else we're going to strip your credentials, right? And you may ask, well, that just seems like common sense. And this is sort of the deeper issue here, right? Is that, again, what you have in effect is that if journalists are going to publish any story about the Pentagon, right? Because remember, if someone gives you information outside the Pentagon or you obtain it in a different way, well, the Pentagon is still going to turn around and say, well, you published this story, let's say, about Venezuelan, U.S. strikes on Venezuelan boats. But let's say your source for it was actually a Venezuelan source, but he was right. The Pentagon is going to say, no. You published this story about us, and it's correct. Therefore, you must have gotten that information from the Pentagon. Therefore, we are going to be pulling your press credentials, right? So that means that the stories themselves have to be run through the Pentagon if you want to maintain your press credentials, which means the Pentagon is only going to allow the press to say what it approves. Or else people simply won't be allowed in the Pentagon at all, right? Now, press freedom organizations denounce this as an attack on the freedom of the press, which of course doesn't bother the administration in any way, shape, or form. They've said that explicitly, right? If the news about our military, this is a quote from the National Press Club, quote, if the news about our military must first be approved by the government, then the public is no longer getting independent reporting. It's getting only what officials want them to see. And so this is actually bad news for almost everyone, because one, the Pentagon has this, well, the Pentagon's already stripped press credentials from a number of established networks, NBC, ABC, and instead, earlier this week, or rather, let's see, when was it started from? Okay, this is in February. They said, listen, the Pentagon's only going to let in what they called smaller, less traditional organizations, like One American News Network. In fact, One American News Network right now is the only one who hasn't had their credentials stripped. And of course, NBC, New York Times, Political, National Public Radio, all are getting booted out of the Pentagon. Kind of weird, right? But this is a deeper problem. Because obviously, let's talk about OAN. OAN is basically a pro-Russian news network. I don't know what else to tell you, right? They, have just an absolutely shameless level of pro-Trump content, but also just straight up like pro-Trump conspiracy theories. For example, they maintain that the 2020 election was fraudulent, totally fake. Bear in mind, if that were true, President Trump is currently in charge of the Justice Department. And to date, at no point in any U.S. court has there ever been any declaration that there was any kind of systematic or sweeping election fraud that took place in 2020. To date, right, again, the Trump DOJ has put 0 people in jail for election fraud. It didn't happen. This is fake. This is nonsense. And again, OAN isn't alone in pushing this, but OAN has never like shied away from absolute nonsense. But they just, so many of their reporters are, it's hard to explain, right? They roll out these conspiracy theories about the Trump Ukraine scandal. OAN broadcast promoted a debunked conspiracy theory about allegedly illegal wiretapping of Trump. OAN broadcast all of Trump's speeches, right? They talked about a fictional America under siege, an attempt to overthrow President Trump. They said that the protests against the George Floyd killing were also a coup attempt, that there was a well-funded network of anarchists trying to take down the president. Just absolute nonsense. Again, if any of this was true, by the way, again, Trump sits in the Oval Office. If it was true, wouldn't he prosecute them? Fine these people if true? But here's where things get really weird. They also tote a lot of pro-Trump or pro-Russia, propaganda. For example, one of their OAN correspondents simply said that Russian ally Bashar al-Assad never conducted a chemical attack. He never staged a chemical attack on his population. The correspondent said, quote, "Not one of the people I spoke to in that neighborhood said they had seen or heard anything about a chemical attack that day, and that all the residents loved Bashar al-Assad." Right? In fact, OAN published claims that Syrian civil service organization, civil aid organization, the White Helmets, staged fake chemical weapons attacks, intending to put the blame on the Assad regime. Absolutely insane stuff, right? And right, so many of their reporters, OANs, simultaneously work for Russian state media. Like, for example, Christian Rose, who works for Sputnik while also working at OAN, which again, to remind you, is the only press outlet allowed to cover the Pentagon. Do you think that's a problem? Right? OAN doesn't disclose that she's also paid by Russian state-owned company. Right? Ruse wholly fabricated a story on OAN in 2017 that Hillary Clinton's PAC secretly gave $800,000 to Antifa, which again, to date, no one's dismantled the evil Antifa network. No one in court has been charged with fucking being systematically fueling Antifa violence or whatever. Right? Globalist conspiracy involving the Clintons, Soros, Bill Gates, Anthony Fauci, and the Chinese governments. Just absolutely comical stuff. And even recently, this was literally from just 4 days ago. This is some dude at OAN. By the way, there's a former Trump Attorney General appointee or candidate, Matt Gaetz, who got this job at OAN. This is an OAN reporter who, you may know, seems to be embedded with Russian military forces. In fact, he's profiling and talking about the evils of, he says, Preston Sharp shares exclusive firsthand accounts from occupied Ukraine. Fighters describe why some Ukrainians joined Russian forces. Others were forced into combat against their will. Civilians tell of their destroyed homes, relentless shelling, and a desperate plea for peace. But this is all what's troubling reporting that he did inside of occupied Ukraine in the Donbas, which again, he refers to as Russia. And he claims that the people of the Donbas voted to join Russia, that they wanted to leave Ukraine, that they are, and this isn't me, these are quotes from this guy. This guy for years has been going on to RT. Right? He talks about how he saw these tragic memorials for children killed in the Donbas. Well, why is there fighting in the Donbas? Oh, it's because Russia annexed it, right? He also, on RT, goes on there and says Russia and Ukrainians are one people, right? It's just, remember, guys, the Russians genocided the Ukrainians. It's kind of hard to be one people when one of you has genocided the other one, right? Every single person I talked with in Donbass said we're Russian. Thank God Putin saved us. Again, I've talked to so many people from the Donbass who said, no, Russia has systematically corrupted the Donbass. They've destroyed the Ukrainian identity, banned the Ukrainian language, and the Donbass is living under military occupation. Okay. Have there been free and fair elections in the Donbass? Absolutely not. And so if a reporter gets you on video, this is a helpful hint. If you ever live under military occupation and a reporter puts a camera in your face and says, what do you think about living under military occupation? You say, I love military occupation. I love the occupation authorities. They are great. Okay. Now, again, given that we just talked about all of this stuff, OAN is the only credentialed press network operating in the U.S. Pentagon. Now, you're like, Paul, well, why? Doesn't the Pentagon have a right to keep its secret secret? Sure, but there's two really important problems here. The first is, in a true democracy, you need information to vote, right? Because how can we, the American public, tell if foreign policy, if defense policy, if the wars fought in our name are being fought in a way that we, the voters, find acceptable? How can we tell? Well, the answer is we need independent, trustworthy reporting. And for a long time, the Department of Defense used to say, no, we don't enable reporters. But the problem that they found is that reporters still reported the news. They would just not give a shit what the Pentagon thought. And that started to become more and more of a problem, especially in Vietnam, right? During the Vietnam War, a lot of the time reporters would just be like, well, Pentagon, F off. We're going to leak whatever we want. The Pentagon said, listen, you could report this story, but you don't have to leak the classified troop numbers, classified military reports, like highly classified information about programs. And so the Pentagon said, listen, how about this? Press can operate in the Pentagon. You guys can access, again, these unclassified areas, right? You can't go into like the SCIF. You can't get secret information. And we're not going to tell you what to report. We're not going to tell you what to say. We're not going to censor your stories. You have freedom of the press. And we just want to make sure that you have a right to be here. You have a right to report on what happens in our defense establishment. You know, again, we're going to give you press credentials so that you play by the rules. The rules about not leaking like super sensitive state secrets. That is sort of the compromise that was settled on in Vietnam. And it's proven really effective. Why? Because Russia doesn't have this, and look how it's going for them. In March 2022, Russia never had free press in any way that we think of it, right? The Russian government has basically suppressed any real kind of dissent, but they tripled down on it, creating a specific law that banned, quote, the discrediting of the armed forces, including stating that it was not right to use the armed forces in the interest of the Russian Federation, which is to say that it was not right to invade Ukraine. So you were not right to discredit them or disseminate what the Russian state called, quote, unreliable information about the armed forces. And it could be punished up to 15 years in prison, right? But here is my gripe with that, right? Is that, let's see if I can find it. You might recall the Battle of Volodar, right? The Battle of Volodar was a town in Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine. One where for almost 2 years of the war, the Russian 155th Naval Brigade was tasked to take this town. Problem is that the town sits on the top of a hill, and it can see everything that's happening around it. And the Russian commander had one strategy that he used, which is to load up a bunch of tanks and infantry, drive them down the only road towards Volodar, and then attack the town of Volodar. The problem is that the Ukrainians would always see it coming, and the Ukrainians annihilated the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade. They killed every one of them, down to a man. And then they got reconstituted with all fresh recruits, and then they annihilated that unit down to a man. And the only reason the Russians changed, they never changed their tactics. They literally started to run out of tanks, and they still weren't changing their tactics. The reason the Russians changed their tactics is because the mill bloggers, the Russian mill bloggers, who, again, up until that point, the Russian government had encouraged because they were seen as hyper-nationalists. They aligned with Putin's stated goals. The mill blogger reports described these things as a meat grinder, as as something where you had 92% casualty rates from a single assault. This was a contradiction of the Russian Ministry of Defense's claims that the brigade had suffered only minor casualties. The ministry's denial was seen as an attempt to downplay a major military failure. The mill bloggers pointed out that these tactics didn't work, and they were proven to not work years prior, driving armored columns through obvious ambush points and minefields. Evidence the brigade was refilled with poorly trained and recently mobilized soldiers sacrificed in wave attacks. And finally, the tactics changed because the mill bloggers shamed the government to do it. And this is an illustration, right? Putin accidentally got the benefits of a free press. Now, admittedly, not before something in the magnitude of 8,000 to 10,000 Russians were annihilated. By the way, that's an entire 20 years of Afghanistan, right? For those of you keeping score at home, just to take Volodar. But that's the takeaway, is that the free press helps war fighting happen, believe it or not. As much as the Pentagon loves to seethe about it, it's important to be able to take information that the Pentagon might not want getting out about the way the war is fought, and be able to take it not just straight to the president, not just up the chain of command, but to the very voters. And the voters get to say, listen, we can support the military. We support this war effort because we know someone, independent reporters, will tell us if things were done in a way that was unacceptable. Look at the Iraq War in Abu Ghraib. The U.S. public supported that war until those photos came out. Until they said, wait, the American military? We liberated the Iraqis. Why are we torturing them? That's not the American way of doing things. That's not the American values that we want to bring to the Iraqis: rule of law and justice. Why are we being just another Saddam? This is important, and not just because it's booting out real independent U.S. media, independent-ish U.S. media. I have gripes with the larger media landscape in America, but it's booting out independent-ish U.S. media and bringing in media that not only is it not independent, but it's actively subverted by an American adversary. Thank you guys for watching, and be sure to hit the subscribe button. But if you want to help Ukrainian units who are in the thick of the fight right now, you can go over to the link in the description and help Ukraine Aid Ops raise funds for Ukraine's elite units who are holding the line in Kramatorsk. Whether it's drones, batteries, eco-flows, whatever these units need, we try to get it to them. The 93rd, the 25th Azov, Lyut, all units that I've personally met and are some of the best in the Ukrainian military are holding the line in Kramatorsk, and we have a huge funding goal, $300,000, but we got help. An anonymous donor, they've pledged dollar for dollar to match every donation you guys make. So check the link in the description, and by the way, it's tax deductible. It's a US 501c3. So thanks to our Colonel tier members over on combatvetnews.com, AL90, James Porsche, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, William Alex, Henry Russier, and all of our Lieutenant tier members. Couldn't do it without you. Appreciate you so much. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.